Welcome to another edition of the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. It's our joy to be with you. This time around, we're going to, again, open up the email inbox and answer some questions that you've been sending our way. As you have questions, send them to questions.dcwp@gmail.com, and Mike keeps them in order for me, and we take episodes like this just to answer questions. So it reminds me of days in the college classroom where I was talking and I was just I was hoping, would someone please ask a question? Because I'd rather take time with the question than just keep plowing ahead with hearing myself talk. So here we go. It's a good one. This is our next question. Is Psalm 45 verse 6 referring to Jesus? Now, I should have it open here because I can't presume everyone has that in mind. It's in fact, the whole Psalm. Let me just read the question because it's more than Psalm 45 verse 6. Psalm 45 ultimately refers to Jesus, of course. That would be the Christian understanding of Psalm 45. But is it possible that the author originally intended it to be understood in terms of the coming Messiah? That's a slightly different way of asking the question. Yes, we can see Psalm 45 ultimately referring to Jesus, but is it possible that the author in writing the psalm actually was thinking in terms of a coming Messiah? So we could attack this in various ways, but let me just get right into again, the value of the question for me is this. Reading the Old Testament from a right-to-left perspective, as we've talked about, without the preconception of Jesus' arrival, offers a properly nuanced understanding of not only the text, but, referring to this question, of the identity of the Messiah. So we've talked a little bit about this, Mike, and I think we kind of agree. Maybe we have some differences here, but this is a curious question. This means that, in my mind, a Christological reading of the Old Testament, to use a term, grants the intrinsic theological and literary richness of the narrative, and especially its portrayal of the Messiah, to unfold organically without imposing a New Testament framework, retroactively back into the text. I know that's a long sentence, but what I'm recommending is that if you want to read it really Christologically and honor that idea, then read the text as a narrative, watch it unfold over time, its expectation of what a Messiah or a chosen one or a servant, there's various ways to define the coming one, and let that organically develop without saying, oh, I know what that is, or I know what that is. Oh, I see Jesus here, or I see Jesus there. Just don't do that. And then I would say, as I close this thought, Jesus can appear then right on cue without changing the meaning of the Old Testament. To me, that's a valuable thing. You don't want to change the meaning of the text, even though you have Christ coming at the conclusion of the text. So that's my shot over the bow when it comes to reading the Bible and finding Jesus. Be careful to find him in the sense of stopping like you're reading a novel and looking up and saying, well, here's why the gun is on the mantle. In chapter 45, he's going to pick up the gun and use it. Well, don't tell your kids that. Let the story go, and it'll get used in time. So now, when it comes to Psalm 45, it is let me talk about it quickly. It's a royal psalm. Mm-hmm. There's several of them. By royal, I mean, in this case, it's traditionally interpreted as a wedding song for an Israelite king who is assuming his role under the authority of the nation's ultimate king, Yahweh. So it's a psalm that is glorifying the king as he and his queen assume their role as the king of Israel under Yahweh's rule, something like that. From a left-to-right reading, the psalm focuses on the king's excellence. You'll hear phraseology, and again, it's very culturally different from what we're used to, but it would make sense to them. The majesty of his reign, and here it comes, emphasizing his divine endorsement. And here's verse 6, your divine throne, or O God. And there's difference of opinion we're going to talk about in a second. But it emphasizes his divine endorsement and the righteousness of his rule. But, and here's my point then, though, by not immediately associating these verses with messianic prophecy, again, we're talking about the King of Israel, not a Messiah, we recognize the human's role as Yahweh's divine agent. That's important to me in the reading of the text, that as we go through Psalm 45, we notice the role of the king as Yahweh's divine agent. We did this back in one of our studies in John. Was this in chapter 10, actually, pretty locally, not very far away in our podcasts, where I showed that, like in Ezekiel 34, when Jesus talks about being the good shepherd, he was probably referring to Ezekiel 34, where it starts with this prophecy against the shepherds of Israel. Thus says the Lord, woe to the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves. And then Jesus will say, contrariwise, I am the good shepherd. But in that text of Ezekiel 34, very importantly, this kind of theme, which is not unique to this book, comes up, where God says, I will seek out my sheep. Yahweh is talking, I will seek out my sheep. But then he quickly turns that to he, and I forget what verse exactly this is, but I have it on the screen here. He shall feed them. Who's the he? Well, I thought it was, there's an I will seek out my sheep, but then the third person shows up. He will feed them, and it turns out to be David, my servant David. So notice how the text can easily flip between I, Yahweh, doing something, and a agent, David. And nobody claims that David is Trinitarian. He's not, in other words, sometimes, again, I think it's important to call out poor argumentation even within an established doctrine like the Trinity. To say that God says I, and then someone is referred to as the I, or, the role of the I, we don't back off this text, for example, and say, see, David's part of the Trinity. No, we know that he is playing out a role that God has established, and he is the one who will feed the sheep that God himself is seeking out. So that kind of idea is very important then to Psalm 45, where here is the text then that really we need to work over. When the questioner asks, is it ultimately about Jesus, and or is the writer actually talking about the Messiah? I suspect he's getting to this verse 7 or 6 in the English text and 7 in the Hebrew text, where we have the term throne, your throne, and then the second word in Hebrew, Elohim, your throne, and then Elohim, it just shows up. There is no vocative case in Hebrew, so you can't tell, a lot of times in the Psalms, "O Lord," or "O God." You have that "O" there. It's put in there because it's a signal that the interpreter thinks it's a vocative use of the word God or Lord, where you just express his name. And that's where, notice how it's translated in most, and here's where Bible Gateway for me is helpful. It's a free online way of just typing in one verse and getting 40 versions immediately. This is Psalm 45, verse 6. Thy throne, or your throne, and most versions, most Christian versions, put O God right there. Thy throne, O God. Now, why is that important? Because to this point in the psalm, we're talking about a human king. And that human king, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, is called Elohim. So that's what these English versions pretty much uniformly do. They make it a vocative use of the word Elohim, or God, capital G, and translate it, Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. And it makes us as Christian readers of Psalm 45 say, oh my, was the psalmist interpreting the human king as an Elohim, right? Okay. Now, what's important to catch is that not every English version does that. because again, there is no vocative case in Hebrew to where you can tell or know that the word is meant to be used, "O God." There isn't, the word "O" is added as kind of a expression of the vocative use. So the CEB version, is that the Christian English Bible, or I forget, Contemporary English Bible? I forget what the abbreviation means. Your divine throne is eternal. Also in the RSV, the old RSV, your divine throne. And of course, the issue there is Elohim. Can that simply not just mean God, capital G, but can it also mean divine? And of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, let's not go through all the work to do this, but clearly we've, as a Divine Council Worldview, you can expect, we have been through this in our discussions. The word Elohim, it doesn't have a capital G on it or capital E. It means divine being. And so sometimes the word Elohim occurs not as the word God, especially capital G, but just as the idea of something which is divine. So some versions, like the RSV, will interpret this, your divine throne. And the argument for that would be that in the parallelism of the psalm, it ends with your royal scepter. It's using the word as an adjective for a noun. Your divine throne, your royal scepter. So, again, what I'm just recommending is watch when English versions differ. This is the best thing about gateway.com, is that you can, and I would have this on your favorites for your browser, because there's numerous times I don't want to get into the accordance and logos systems, or they're not up and running or something, and I just want to know how a verse is translated in every version. Just type it in and you get them all in one moment. So whenever you have a difference of interpretation or a different version of, or when translations differ, you at least have to back up and take your time, realizing that there's different ways to understand that Greek or Hebrew phrase. By the way, if you open up a Jewish study Bible, the Jewish Publication Society, it reads, your divine throne is everlasting, your royal scepter. So the Jewish Bible agrees with the RSV. On the side note, this is interesting. I took a picture of the study note in the Jewish study Bible. This may also be translated, your throne, O God, is everlasting, which the Septuagint has in Greek, your throne, O God. And notice then what it says, where the king is referred to as God, capital G. If this is taken literally, this psalm would be unique in the entire Bible in explicitly depicting the king as divine, a notion that existed at times in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, like the Pharaoh, but is otherwise absent in biblical thought. A long way of saying, folks, if this is, O King, or your throne, O God, calling the king God, this is the only place in our Hebrew Bible that this happens. So at least they're giving it a possibility, and you can, of course, read the note farther if a person wants to get other Jewish rabbis and their thinking. But this excites the Christian, and it gives pause to the Jew when the text says, thy throne, O God, or thy divine throne. So the little note at the bottom of the text in the Hebrew Study Bible mentions 1 Chronicles 29:23, which has this, Solomon successfully took over the throne of Yahweh as king instead of his father David. Fascinating, phrase, the throne of Yahweh. Not the throne of David, but the throne of Yahweh. And that's that's a straight line of Hebrew there. There's nothing to be debated. In fact, if you look it up in the English versions, again, gateway.com, Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord. So, again, we don't make Solomon part of the Trinity, even though it says he's on Yahweh's throne, right? But we say there's an agent or something like that. He's given the authority to sit on Yahweh's throne, even as a human. So fascinating thought there. We're back to, I guess, the bigger question then, Mike, as I close my thoughts. Is Psalm 45 messianic? I would say it's certainly, it is to me in this sense that by the time you're coming through David and Solomon, they have a sense that because David was promised this by Nathan as the prophet, that your name, your family will never cease to be the one to sit on the throne, provided, I think this is an implied proposition, as long as you're loyal to Yahweh, he's never going to change his mind. Your family will always be on the throne of Israel. So, of course, Jesus fulfills that. So my recommendation is don't put Jesus in there as though, looking up from your text and telling your audience that the psalmist knew that the coming Messiah would be God. I would say that's not clear enough in the text for me to say that. It's as the Jewish study note says, if that's God, that's the only time it is in the entire corpus of the Old Testament. And we don't know that the vocative is meant to be the translation. That's why, again, in their actual translation, they just say, your divine throne, your royal scepter. And, of course, with that story behind it comes 1 Chronicles 29, where Solomon is sitting on the throne of Yahweh. So that's how it gets to be a divine throne. All right. Anything you want to add there?
I think it's just interesting to see how, as I was listening to you and also digging a little bit into my logos about this, it seems to be that the general consensus is the locality of Psalm 45. It's a royal psalm. Maybe it was meant for Solomon. But what's interesting is folks tend to then so that's all it really was. No, because eventually once the Psalter, the book of Psalms, is being compiled together as the oral traditions, all the oral words of what the Jewish people had, especially by the time they were in Babylon, they are starting to codify. They're starting to write these things down because they're trying to make sure they don't forget. The arrangement and the reasons why they put down Psalm 45 and why it became not just a wedding song for the king, but there was something immensely powerful about those words. And the fact that the Jewish Study Bible pointed out is this is apparently the only case, the only time something like this happens. It makes you wonder then what was going on in the minds of those of that community as they were compiling the works of the Psalter, for example. Why did it become so important for the exilic and post-exilic Jews? As well as I was looking up, I saw what the Septuagint translations have, and also the Aramaic. The Aramaic also follows along that same thing, and it's kind of funny. The rabbis in here also add their little flourish of commentary of your God, your throne, O God, is in the heavens forever and ever.
Yeah, that's new.
The scepter of your kingdom is a kingdom of equity. It's so they're trying to kind of add a little more, extra languaging to try to help their people understand what is this psalm saying. And so it seems to be, at least from two external witnesses around the time of the Second Temple period, they seem to not think that it was describing the throne as being divine, but that your throne, and then talking to God. So it's interesting, and it just causes you to have this weird curiosity of what is going on here. And I agree with you, Ron, that it is wonky at times when folks get very, I would say the word sloppy with the way that they would try to insert David is somehow part of the Trinity or Solomon is part of the Trinity. David and Solomon became bigger, larger figures than what they actually were themselves. I think that's something that some folks fail to realize, that when we see words like my servant David, or my father David. Especially when you see prophets talking to the great grandson of David, and yet refers to David, to this king, your father David. It's like, well, he's not my father. He's my father, my grandfather by 7 generations ago. It's meant to show that these two, especially their names, had become larger than life and became almost like a title and not really about the person anymore. Mm-hmm. And so there is just a fascinating psalm. I would definitely agree that it is messianic in the sense that it reveals what was going on in the minds, or it hints at least what's going on in the minds of the community that was compiling the psalms, of what they were looking forward to. Why would they care for a wedding song unless there was something about the wedding song that appeals to a deeply embedded hope within the community? And they were looking for the Messiah. They were looking for the son of David, not the great grandson of David. They were looking for the son of David to finally come and to rescue the people, to deliver them from the Romans, to deliver them from the exile that they have felt they have been in for a long time. So, yeah, I mean, it's a cool psalm. It's a really cool psalm.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts. Yeah. We got one more question, but go ahead, and we have a sponsor again for our podcast.
We do, and today's podcast sponsor is by Certified Financial Planner Josh Taylor. He is with the Kompass Financial Advisors. That is Compass with a K. And so, Ron, maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit more about what Josh does and how he could help them with their financial planning.
Josh Taylor with Kompass Financial Advisors is a Christian independent certified financial planner here to help you design a custom plan to achieve your investment planning goals. He offers advice on IRAs, 401k rollovers, and pension benefits, as well as answering your questions about integrating annuities into your plan. With over 30 years of professional investment experience, Josh will provide a unique perspective for your personal goals. He brings Christian investment ideas with him, which is very exciting. For more information, contact Josh Taylor at www.compassfinancial.com, and remember that Compass is spelled with a K. Thank you, Josh. Our second and last question for our time together on this podcast is, again, interesting acknowledgement of a verse, or actually several verses that I had fun running down. Jesus, the righteous one. Please give a DCW opinion, if you want to call it that, on the application of the word righteous to Jesus in such passages as Acts 3:14, 7:52, 22:14, and 1 John 2:1. By the way, is there a DCW opinion on things? I suppose that sometimes there is. I would also say, akin to, is there a Reformed view of something or a Baptist view of something? Those are what do you call it? Venn diagrams, circles that overlap sometimes. And a DCW view may not be unique to itself, but certainly you're hearing two guys who have a DCW approach passages, and this is no different. So I take that to mean on this question, what do you think of this passage, especially thinking in terms of what it's like to believe in a DCW as a lens in reading Scripture? Here's my quick overview of the material. In Acts 3:14, but you denied the holy and righteous one. Acts 7:52, they killed those who announced the coming of the righteous one. Just where you'd expect them to say Jesus, the phrase rolls off their lips, the righteous one. Acts 22:14, Paul is talking about his Damascus Road experience. The God of our fathers appointed you to see the righteous one. He's comparing, in fact, almost, again, there's differentiating between Yahweh there, or at least God of our fathers, with Jesus, the righteous one. And then in this interesting little quip in 1 John 2:1, if anyone sins, he's just said, let's all admit we sin and sin a lot. And then he says, if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. Why does he add that phrase, the righteous? Well, these verses share, as you look at all four of them, the common context of Jesus being a truly innocent man whom Israel rejected. That's certainly in the Acts versions of this phrase. So the contrast with Barabbas in Acts 3:14, highlighting a miscarriage of justice. Or in the case of Acts 22:14, with Paul seeing the risen Messiah, which would have struck the original hearer as the vindicated one. He has been vindicated by God the Father in his resurrection. So I guess I would say, as a immediate reaction, Jesus is called the righteous one because he was fully faithful to his Father's will, even up to death, right? Because death is the issue. He has been put to death, and he shouldn't have been. He was innocent, but he allowed himself to be killed. And so the righteous one seems to be implying this idea of being faithful unto death, even when that death was not deserved. His execution also signaled judicial inversion, this idea that a miscarriage of justice was done to him. He was righteous, yet he was killed. Miscarriage of justice, and foreshadowing, of course, in the book of Acts will be many followers of Jesus who will undergo that same persecution, which is in the mind of the writers, injust. It also signals, I think we can add this in the Acts 22 story, that the resurrection of Jesus vindicated him from God's point of view, from the Father's point of view. So again, foreshadowing that the resurrection of Jesus not only vindicates Jesus, it vindicates us as believers in Jesus as well. So a lot going on there. Maybe I don't mean to read too much into it, but I'm trying to grapple with, how does that phrase, the righteous one, 4 times slip off the writer's tongue as though it becomes almost like it's 4 times, so I don't want to make too much of it, but kind of a title, a surname, something he's known for, a cliched way of describing Jesus, the righteous one. I would end with this, Mike, that just like we should always do, when you think in terms of the Old Testament, and it's fair to say, to me, this is DCW. Tell me if I'm getting too, I don't know, just have my own view on this, but to me, this comes from you know what? It's a left to right reading on the text. So I'm going to say this is a DCW read. Here we go. In Old Testament thought, righteous, tzaddik in Hebrew, dikaios in Greek, often describes faithfulness to Yahweh as opposed to moral behavior. What I'm getting away from, in other words, when Jesus is called the righteous one, and maybe it's my Reform background that comes screaming out at me now, they'll often talk of righteousness being something that's imputed. Jesus is righteous, and I am not righteous. There is none righteous, no, not one. And the only way I become righteous is through the imputation of his righteousness to my account. And we speak of it that way in the Reformed camp. That's how I was taught. And I would recommend, no, that's not a left to right reading of the Old Testament. Well, how so? Well, like I say here, we can be righteous ones while Jesus is the righteous one. That's how I'd recommend it. That coming out of the Old Testament story, if you read the Bible, again, left to right, being righteous is not a problem to the story of the Bible. Many people are righteous. In fact, the first 4 times, and I just asked my computer, give me give me the English, but show me where the Hebrew word tzaddik, righteous, is used. And I go to the Psalms, for example, because this is a very easy way to show the listener how it's used. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the tzaddik, the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Notice that that. And then the next time it's used is Psalm 5:12. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. Psalm 7:9. Let the evil of the wicked come to an end, and may you establish the righteous. So the first 4 times that Tzaddik is used in the Psalms, it's referring to humans. Yes, at the end of 7:9, O righteous Elohim, O righteous God is used. So this idea that God alone is righteous and I have to get imputed righteousness, I think is a very errant idea that is not based on the text. It's based on a misunderstanding of, basic lexical meaning of what righteousness means. And so what I want to get away from as I give you, again, my final thoughts about Jesus being the righteous one, I don't think it means, nor do I have any Bible to really support this in a contextual way, that Jesus' righteousness becomes mine by means of imputation. That idea, I think, is read into the text. And the story that's in the Bible itself is, as you're loyal to Yahweh, you're considered righteous, tzaddik or dikaios. And the ultimate loyalist, in other words, I get it the same way Jesus does. I get the title righteous the same way Jesus will get the title righteous. I'm loyal to Yahweh. Jesus happens to be the righteous one in the sense that his loyalty, Hebrews 3, Moses was faithful as a servant, but Jesus was faithful as a son. There is a difference maybe of quantity and quality of righteousness, but it's still the same meaning, and that is a loyalty to Yahweh and a willingness to follow Yahweh wherever that leads, especially even unto death. And so as Jesus goes through the garden and prays the prayer and says, not my will, but thine be done, that is that is the evidence of his righteousness, shall we say. And so that the righteous one as a term becomes known over Jesus as a title almost because of his loyalty to the Father, not because of moral behavior and, the sinlessness that we often think of being attributed or imputed to the Christian. So my last thought there that I'm putting on the screen is just my argument against imputation. I don't know why we think that way. I don't see the text arguing for it in a left to right version of the Bible. But again, I know that my Reformed friends will respond, and so that's fine. And as you often say, you weren't trained on it, so you don't have to to worry about it. But it is interesting how often when I would say, if I were to show this to a reformer, he'd say, no, this is not the way it works. To which I'd say, well, let the conversation begin. But before I mention what I found out about the righteous one, but I am curious, Ron. Do you think there is some level of an exchange that is happening? Not in the sense of, because I do agree that there is something very individualistic about the way that Reformed theology, when it comes about the imputation aspect of righteousness, it's very, very individualistic. Oh yeah, to a point that it's to me, yes, for me as a living human being who wants to be loyal to the Creator and loyal to King Jesus, yeah, that's through allegiance, that's through loyalty, but it's always going to be imperfect. It's not ever going to be 100% consistent all the time. And I look towards Jesus as being the most faithful one. Right.
And that since we are, as Paul would say, we're all part of his body. He is the head. He goes before all of us. He is the one that actually is who's in front. And so we join in his life because of our unity with him by his Spirit.
Fair enough.
And so, I follow and I emulate his steps. I follow after him, but he's ultimately the one that is at the head of this whole entire glory train, so to speak, the conquering king that is coming. He's the one that everyone's eyes focus on, not on all the people behind him, not on all the individuals behind him, but everyone's eyes focus on the one who is called the faithful one, the one whose faithfulness pleased his Father.
Well, let me answer your question with a question. Can you be loyal to the same God that Jesus was?
Yes.
And when you say yes, which I thought you would say, what is the title that the Bible gives you because of that loyalty?
The Holy One.
Or, righteous, holy, yeah. So in other words, and I know that's kind of a leading question, but to me, in other words, you're right, or let's think of Cornelius in Acts 10. He's called righteous twice. Why? I think it's because the text just acknowledged here's a God-fearer who was loyal to Yahweh, and he wanted to join the Abrahamic covenant, and Peter said no. Yet he's righteous, and so that's how the word is used. So that's why I'm always going to push against the idea of substitution or imputation, because I don't sense it's going that way.
Well, I'm not arguing about substitution. I guess what I'm arguing is about the quality. Right?
That comes into the question of how loyal can a person be, and that. By the way, that's another question coming in. I saw it on the list of questions that people had sent in. Is the issue of, I forget how they asked it, but when does loyalty not take into account moral behavior or something like that? And let's deal with that when we get there. But that's a good point. That can you be immoral, just classically immoral, and be a loyalist? I would quickly use the illustration of marriage. I can be loyal to Susan. When I get married and I say at the altar in front of my witnesses, I choose you, Susan, we don't have to get into details what that means. We all acknowledge what that means, that I'm going to go to the same house every night. I might be upset. She might be upset with me, whatever. But we're not going to go to someone else's house. That's what it means, okay? And so why can't we do the same thing with our loyalty to Yahweh? It's to Yahweh, not to Molech. It's to Yahweh, not to Baal. It's to Jesus, not to the Caesar. In other words, it's a which one question, not a how well question. And that's why I think I would say the same thing about righteousness as a term. It's not a how well question. It's a which one question. And left on that level, now the Psalms make sense. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor the sinners in the congregation of there's a classification righteous of people in the Old Testament who could be called righteous, David included, who were morally wicked people, but they're still righteous because of that loyalty to Yahweh. So I guess
I get what you mean, and I agree about that actually, ironically, as you mentioned about the congregation of the righteous, I think that's part of what I think part of sometimes we're blind to the fact that our Western individualism is playing a much bigger factor in how we're thinking about phrases like that. Because I totally agree. Congregation of the righteous, they're righteous, because righteous is not about the moral quality; it is about their loyalty. But at the same time, I also want to quantify, though, that, but the congregation of the righteous, they center around one who is righteous. There's somehow something about this one who's righteous is way more, some reason more, not necessarily morally, but just there's more to it. I don't know if that makes sense. It's just... Anyhow.
Well, God is always the ultimate of which we are the part. So God, there's a lot of shared qualities between God and me, but he always gets the nod with the perfection part of it. So I forget all the shared qualities that theologians talk about between God and us, but he always gets the perfect version of that, and I get the weak human version of it. So obviously the morality issue is going to be in play. I'm not going to be the perfect loyalist in behavior, though I would say, I think I can do, like with David will do this in Psalm 7. That I am righteous. I forget how he says it. And yet, well, I think what he's saying is, I don't pray to any other God. That's just how it's going to be. And I can say, and I'm not proud, I just think it's just the way the covenants work. I have never worshiped another God besides Jesus that I know of. I have never prayed to another God. I'm aware of them. I respect them, their role they have, but I will not give my heart and mind to another deity. That, to me, answers the question in the Bible of what a righteous man is. And so I know that those terms aren't used that way in modern theology, but that's their problem.
Now, what's interesting about that term, that righteous one, when I was also digging into it, there is some Second Temple allusions, such as coming from the book of First Enoch, where that term is used. And apparently it's drawing from Old Testament texts talking about the suffering servant, especially in Isaiah.
Okay.
And also Jeremiah
53:11, I think it is.
Yeah, Isaiah 9, Isaiah 11, and Isaiah 53, where righteousness is associated to this suffering servant figure that appears within the book, and then also in Jeremiah 23. And so this kind of suffering servant motif is connected to he is the righteous one. And then eventually, by the time we get to the Second Temple period, that title, righteous one, is connected to the apocalyptic visions that's going on in First Enoch.
Yeah.
And so it's all in that kind of stream of thought. So then by the time we get to the New Testament, yeah, they're using that phrase because it's just kind of floating there in the cultural mindset of the Jewish people. They're thinking of like, well, we're looking for the Messiah who is supposedly going to be connected to this suffering servant from Isaiah. And then what are the New Testament writers basically saying? Yeah, that's Jesus.
Yeah,
Jesus is the righteous one.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, well, thank you. I think we have done enough for one night again, and we tear questions apart enough, I hope, and put them back together again so that we can say, obviously, thank you to the people that ask the question and encourage more. We have more in the hopper, which we'll get to in our podcast to come. We are in the study of John, and we'll continue that as well. But we wanted to take our time. I think this is our fourth, or maybe more. I forget how many in a row we've done with Q&A, but we need to keep these questions moving along because we want to honor each as they come. So thank you again, Mike, for your time. It's always fun to get your spontaneous response, and it's worth my time to hear them and everyone else's time to hear them as well. So thank you, everyone. If you have questions in the future, go ahead and send them to questions.dcwp@gmail.com. Until we speak again, may you enjoy being called righteous because of your loyalty to Jesus and the Father.